Shane.
We are recording. So straighten your hair and, straighten your ties. As we were building our speaker portfolio for this At Nourish series, I realized that we had somebody who was quite well known who actually said, I'll do a talk. And when somebody says, I'll do a talk, if I could have, I would have hugged Charlie. Charlie Steindel is actually Charles Steindel, Dr. Charles Steindel, former senior vice president of the New York Federal Reserve. When I Googled Charlie, I couldn't believe the number of articles that I found. I did not try.
How many of them
read
were
it.
New Jersey's chief economist blows forecasts and leaves? There are a lot of those.
I missed those. I only saw the good ones. So I thought, this is a time where having a conversation about what this all means in economic terms is appropriate. So, Charlie, I'm going to turn it over to you with great thanks that you're willing to do this. As we always do, we're going to mute the audience because it gets distracting. If you have questions, put them in the chat, or we'll pause and we'll have opportunity, and I'll try and handle the questions and pass Charlie so he doesn't have to look at the chat. So with that, welcome. It's really good to see. There are a lot of faces that I don't often see at these, so good to see you all. Charlie.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Shirley. Okay, I'm going to start, give a little bit of talk. I'm going to just talk about some of the numbers we've seen since the start of the pandemic. I'm going to talk about how the government actually responded to that in economic terms. I'm not going to be talking about various orders and fusses over anti-malarial drugs or anything like that. I'm going to give some thoughts on the outlook, and I'm going to conclude my comments by, sometimes they say there's some sort of dispute between economists and epidemiologists. I'll give my thoughts on that. So I'll start with the numbers. And the immediate shock from the shutdowns back in March was massive. It was staggering. Just to review, the unemployment rate rose from 3.5% in February, which is a very low number, to 14.7% in April. This is one of the occasions where it's good to put the full number. That's the highest figure since the 1930s, since the Great Depression, easily. Previous record was, I think, 10.8%. Industrial production tumbled. Retail sales just collapsed because most brick and mortar stores and restaurants were closed. I know Amazon and the supermarkets gained a lot, but that only filled a little bit of the gap. Now, the nation was recently said to have started to gone into an official recession back then, after the longest expansion on record. Just to clarify, people think a recession is 2 straight quarters of declines in gross domestic product or GDP. That's kind of a myth. Actually, recessions are not determined by the government, by the Fed. There really is a committee of economists which sits down and decides, are we in a recession or not? I happen to know a lot of them, and they make the call and everybody accepts it. And a few weeks ago, they said, yeah, we're in a recession. Surprise, surprise. May and June, after the horrible, horrible months of March and especially April, saw rebounds. We're still getting a few May numbers, and June numbers are coming in, and they're pretty strong too. These are strong numbers by any historic standards, but we're really pretty far, far deep in the hole compared to February. The unemployment rate was over 11% in June. That, except for the 2 numbers before then, would have been the highest rate since the 1930s. There is talk now about renewed shutdowns to prevent or deal with a second wave. Could, of course, slow the pace of improvement, maybe even lead to some dips down. I mean, I just saw just before United Airlines, which had announced a big expansion in its flight schedule in August, has decided to dial that back a bit. Now, even though we got better numbers in May and June, we don't yet have the number for GDP for the second quarter. That's not out until July 30th. despite the better numbers in May and June, we're going to have a double-digit rate of decline in the second quarter. The only question is how big. It'll be the biggest decline on record. We don't have quarterly GDP numbers in the Great Depression. Now, just to say what this number means, suppose that it's completely possible the number comes out minus 35%. My personal number is actually a little deeper than that, the number I've been, putting down. Now, that doesn't mean that output in the second quarter fell 35%. That 35% is an annual rate of decline. That's just how we express the number. What that means is if we continued falling at the same rate in the second quarter for 3 more quarters after that, for 4 straight quarters, at the end we'll be 35% below where we were. So it isn't a 35% in 1 quarter. It's actually more like 10%, which is still pretty awful. So the 35%, and I'm sure there'll be complaints saying that's exaggerating it, we're only down 10%. That's a big decline in 1 quarter. Now, so those are the numbers we've been seeing. And contrary to what you may hear, I think the government's economic policy response, I'm not talking about what it did about personal equipment or ventilators or anything else in March and April, were, I think, pretty good. They weren't actually too bad in March and April. The main action was on the spending side. I'll get to that in a minute. But my old place, where I get that nice pension check every month, the Fed stepped in on early and massively. Now, the big danger when you get a situation like what it seems the end of the world is coming, which certainly seemed like that at times in March, is that we saw the massive sell-off in the stock market. It was down like 35%. We saw the stock market collapse. But more importantly, you see credit markets dry up. Nobody wants to lend money. Everybody's scared. They want to hold on to their money. It's a natural reaction. And that's terrifying because that means the whole financial system can stop and the flow of credit completely stops. No matter what you might say about Wall Street, a good place to work or the font of all evil, the credit markets completely stop. The economy stops. You have to have the credit markets responding to that. We saw that. I saw that a little too close, pretty close. I wasn't at the heart of things, but I saw enough of it in 2008, and it was pretty frightening. The Fed and the Treasury learned from that episode. They learned really a lot about what should be done. So the Fed went in almost immediately, in fact, even earlier than I would have expected, and lowered its interest rate, the interest rate the Federal Reserve worries about, which is the rate banks lend to each other, to what Fed speak calls the effective lower bound. That's fancy Fed talk for zero. We don't talk about zero. We talk about effective lower bounds. And it began massive purchase of government bonds. Now, why do you buy government bonds at that time? The point is everybody's afraid. So if you're completely afraid the end of the world is coming, what do? You buy treasuries. You're not lending to the private market. So the Fed is stepping in massively, buying treasuries, lowering their rates even more to insanely low levels. And that might tempt some people to think, they've been acting by fear, but maybe a little greed comes in. This is insanely low. Maybe I can actually lend to a private borrower. It's risky, but at least it's better than what I'm getting in treasury bonds. That's the point of doing that. And then the second important point is once the Treasury got legislative authority to do this in April, the Fed and Treasury set up these entities, vehicles, limited LLCs, to purchase private credit, to purchase loans, to purchase bonds, to purchase commercial paper. So what happens in those schemes, which is something which was started in 2008, the Treasury puts up some seed money. The Federal Reserve isn't allowed to make an investment, buy anything, to take a loss. So the Treasury takes the first loss. The Treasury puts in some seed money, 5-10%, assuming the amount of loss that would happen. And the Fed then just lends a whole ton of money to that entity, and the entity goes out and buys these private securities. We did a lot of that in 2008. This time, just the mere creation, the Fed's announcement with the Treasury, we're setting these things up. These are what are called lenders of last resort. You can always place your loan through these new entities if you can't do it through the regular channels. It's given private lenders the confidence to stay in the markets. Actually, very little has been purchased of these. That's a little technical, but when you hear about the Fed is buying corporate debt, that's what's going on. Now, on the spending side, you had a lot of a partisan storm and drama between Pelosi and McConnell, et cetera, et cetera. The fact is that in this spring, legislation was passed that massively increased, I think, pretty timely federal assistance to the unemployed, to troubled businesses, and to some state and local governments. There were the $1,200 individual grants, the $600 a week to the unemployed, the extra $600 a week, which includes some self-employed workers who are not normally eligible for unemployment benefits, the PPP, which we used, the synagogue used, and more. Now, there's a usual commentary now, and we're seeing a lot of it every day, about the big corporations getting more than their share. People are being paid too much to stay home idle. The $600 a week plus regular unemployment is more than what some people are making, which actually, of course, people would say if you have a raging epidemic, it seems like a sensible public health policy. Keep the people home. There were difficulties processing all those PPP applications and getting the funding. People had problems filing for unemployment insurance. The state systems were overwhelmed. Checks were going to the dead. We heard about that. All that stuff was going on, and the papers are full of all that every day. Well, what do you think is going to happen when master programs are thrown together in a matter of weeks? Of course, this is going to happen. Right. We wanted to wait till you ironed out all the details, put in all the nice safeguards to prevent fraud and abuse. Nothing would have been done. We'd still be setting up the legislation. Now, I'm an economist. Economics is a discipline about choosing between evils. Frankly, we call it the science of choice. And I think the evils that accompanied these programs, they make nice stories in the paper every day, were much, much less than the evils of not doing anything or waiting for something more finely tuned. That's just my opinion. Well, what were the advantages of these programs? In the crudest terms, it kept people and families alive. Okay? Helped keep families alive, kept them in their home, relatively safe, not pounding the streets in an epidemic looking for a job. And it slowed, not completely, the pace of business failures. It's called stimulus, but it really isn't a classical stimulus program. It's like putting the economy in a heart-lung machine until longer-term remedies like a vaccine and the like are in place. Now, I'm saying the policy was good in March and April, doesn't mean that policy is done. We've had all the news that indicates, the horrible news from Texas, from Florida, from Arizona. We're not in a position from a public health standpoint to fully reopen the economy. And I think every politician in America now, except one prominent one, seems to think that. Maybe two or three, might be a governor or two, who doesn't think that. Maybe we've gained some insight and we can avoid a complete second lockdown. Maybe the lockdown was hurried, maybe it went a little too far. It didn't have to be quite so drastic. For example, we didn't have to shut all construction sites, for instance. Perhaps, we really don't know. But I don't think we should go out of our hands and sort of like pull the mat out from the unemployed and said, workers starve going out in an epidemic. We don't want businesses to rush to reopen for the very same reason. And we don't want too many to fail. If you just got a lot of businesses failing, going out completely, when you finally get around to fully reopening, it just screws everything up. It screws everything up because people have to restart the firms, they have to get a lease, they have to hire people, they have to get credit. It's a lot easier to get restarted when you have firms that are still in place. So at the least, we should continue some form of expanded unemployment benefits. Maybe $600 a week isn't the right number, and we should aid true small businesses. One thing which did bother me was they were providing the PPP on the official definition of a small business. The government's official definition of a small business is one that has fewer than 500 employees. That's kind of a joke. And today they're reporting, they've issued reports about who got the PPP loans. a lot of companies which had exactly 500 employees. These are big firms which managed to slice it up. You have to expect that sort of thing to happen. That definition of small business has always been terrible, terrible. So we probably need some more of that, though. State and local governments, they have borne the brunt of the direct spending on the epidemic. Desperately need further federal assistance. Many healthcare centers, hospitals, and the like need more. And actually, I'm optimistic. When you read the stories today, I think much of this is going to happen. There isn't there are arguments about what form these stuff should take exactly, what should happen. Unfortunately, there's a usual silliness. We need a tax cut. We don't need a tax cut. But I think something will happen in the next few weeks. I don't think the rug is going to get pulled out from everybody. Now for my outlook. It's actually surprisingly the case that the nation has seen episodes, not as long as this, not as severe as this, well, not too bad, where much of the economy is basically stopped. So it's not completely unprecedented. I'm not going to talk about whether it's going to be a W or a V or a U or whatever letter people want. We have episodes like 1933. If you read the history books, the banking system completely collapsed. Roosevelt, the first thing he did after it was inaugurated was to close all the banks of the country. All the banks of the country to sort out the mess. For a week or so, there were no banks operating in the country. You couldn't cash a check. You couldn't get cash if you needed it. You have things like that happen. That's why that point in 1933 is the very bottom of the Great Depression, of the banks. We actually surprisingly had a very sharp cut in, of all times, 1944, 1945. You hear about the booming wartime economy. Well, in 44, we're on the way to winning the war. They began to cut back on military orders in 1945 when the war ended. They cut them off completely. Military production plunged. The civilian economy wasn't ready to take off. And you see some really terrible industrial production and employment numbers, really things going bad. A lot of the people were out kissing in Times Square and VJ Day were probably laid off munitions workers. They went to Times Square and found a nurse to kiss for something to do. In 1980, I don't know how many people will remember this, but I certainly do. But in the spring of that year, I was at the board then. The Fed imposed credit controls in 1980, in the spring, and that led to an incredible collapse of the economy. We couldn't believe it. We didn't think it would have that sort of effect. We removed them pretty quickly. And in that 2008, of course, we had the financial crisis. So we've had episodes where the economy has done these breathtaking dives. 1933 and 2008 show you, if you lose your financial system, you have a lot of business failures and bankruptcy. It takes a long, long time to get back to normal. 1944, 45, and 1980 were more like the V's. You took care of what were depressing things, you pop back up. In 1980, there was a recession later on, but that's a different story. 1945, it took a while for civilian production to gear up, but you moved back pretty closely. This time, I suspect, unless, knock wood, some super vaccine miraculously soon appears, or maybe the cold weather removed the bug. I don't know. We said hot weather, maybe the cold weather, the first frost. We're on the long path, I think. And obviously, everybody's speculating about much of the way we live, we work, we rear and educate our children, and play is going to remain dramatically different than the recent past. So we have weird things I just saw. The movie theaters are suing Murphy because he won't open them again. He says, you open the churches, but you don't open us? What are you doing? So we get very weird things going on. This is going to have a long economic cost, a long-term cost, and even without a second wave causing massive shutdowns. Now, can we speed things up? The Fed can't do it. I'll use the term, I hate to say it, I'm going to be editing a journal, which is going to have a lot of articles on the pandemic, and I told the one who was going to write about the Fed, don't use this phrase, because I've heard it too often, but I'll use it. The Fed has lending but not spending power. Could lend to people, but it can't do outright spending. Okay, but the federal government has that ability to step up to the plate and provide all sorts of assistance to re-engineer the economy. simple things by paying for plastic barriers in schools or wherever people work, better ventilation in buses and trains, maybe these UV ventilating systems in places where people congregate, provide better access to broadband for people who will need it to work remotely, healthier daycare facilities, and of course, larger reserves of PPE. These won't come cheap. Of course, it'll be said after the fact that if a vaccine comes along, well, we didn't have to spend that money. But we could think of this as a war. The war, you buy a lot of things you find out later you don't need. Now, a lot of you can all raise your hands or chat, grew up in the city in the 60s, say. I would say the 50s, that would make it a little extreme. And you all remember all the apartment houses suddenly around 1960 had these signs put up, fallout shelter, pointing to the basement. All those tin signs are still around there. And, I bet there's still cans of food moldering in those fallout shelters that were bought to stock those things. That was a waste. Now, how much would this stuff cost? I don't know, but I think we're talking about the order to, fully prepare and re-engineer to cope with this. Maybe a few $100 billion, which sounds like a lot of money, but comparing to the economy, not stopping along, comparing to what we're spending on unemployment insurance and other things, it's not really that much. So that's what should be considered. My final comments: people say there's some sort of conflict between economists and epidemiologists. Economists worry that the steps proposed by epidemiologists to cope with the pandemic are too damaging. I think that's nonsense. I can't speak for all economists, only the ones I know and the ones I respect. All believe that the utter first priority is getting the disease under control, and understand that the epidemiologists are the ones who know the ins and outs of how to do this. Now, of course, economists have been offering technical assistance. So economists can figure out, well, if you impose this sort of shelter in place to affect these people, it has this economic effect. And there is a trade-off between this economic effect and how much control you're getting over the disease, how much you're slowing the spread. And so you can have various types of economists say, well, there are various groups of people. You can encourage a shelter in place or industries to close down for a given level of transmission. That's just technical advice. That's to be provided to the policymakers making the decisions. The economists are not making the call or anything like that. It's not to preempt the epidemiologists for understanding the basic modes of transmission of the disease or anything. I mean, we can go to the extreme, and that's, of course, how this gets talked about. If you had wanted absolute, total, near-term and elimination of the disease, that cost would be utterly, utterly vast. It would be incredible. It would be something like China did in Wuhan that first month, but worldwide, continued for a few months. Well, you're not going to do that. That's ridiculous. That's not sustainable. That's not going to be done. No epidemiologist would have proposed anything like that. That's getting a little crazy. But I'm not aware that anybody's ever proposed anything like that. So that's my upshot. We've had this big, massive hit. We're starting to come out of it, but it's going to be a long road back. The second wave stuff and everything, that's going to be noise, I think, on the road back. That's not necessarily mean we're going to go back to where we were in April. At least I don't think we will. I think the policy did some things right at the beginning. We need to do some more things right. I hope we can. And don't focus on articles saying this, some economist says something wacky about this. They're pretty much all in agreement. And that's my spiel. Ready for questions.
Dr. Steindel.
All right. So I see what the first one just came in. And the first one is, will all the money the government is injecting into the economy result in high inflation?
Well, that's a popular one. I mean, there is this belief the government is spending massive amounts of money. The Federal Reserve is, quote, expanding its balance sheet, which is, the way people talk about this there. And they say, ooh, inflation's on the horizon. Well, there's two things that's going on there. First of all, a lot of this is actually, we think about in terms of prices, they're preventing all prices from collapsing. A massive deflation, by the way, is part of what's going on. Second thing is, a lot of this, it's on a bigger scale, but we have a bigger event to what was done in 2008, 2009. We didn't have any inflationary consequences from that. And I don't think there's any particular reason to think that there will be right now. So I don't think of this as an active risk. I don't think the Federal Reserve or anybody else really thinks this is a very active risk.
So Charlie, moving from inflation, what do you think what's the market what's driving the stock market now? And where do you think that's going? Because the stock market has been certainly acting erratically on occasion.
There was a 35% decline, of course, the incredible plunge. And we've basically taken back about, 90% or more of that decline. The stock market is now, it's a little below its peak in early February, but it's, about where it was in January. It's about 9% higher than it was a year ago. So there was a lot of speculation as to why the stock market came back. There was some snide speculation that it was just, basically people sitting around at home trying to be smart Alex and buy various stocks and pump things up. I think that's been dismissed. I think everybody was saying there was this run up in Hertz because Hertz had gone bankrupt and was talking about issuing more stock, which is crazy. But then some people were buying Hertz and drove the price up. But I think what happened was two reasons why the stock market has rallied. First of all, interest rates are so incredibly low. If you want a return, maybe you should buy a stock. You could at least get a dividend or something like that. You might get that. So we have just the interest rate side of it. The second thing is you might look at the outlook for profits and earnings. And I've been looking at them. Profits are going to be severely hit this year. There's no question. Profits, maybe half this year what they were last year. That's normally negative for the stock market. But I think people are thinking the outlook further on is probably a bit better. So as best I can say, I don't know whether the current price of the stock market makes sense. You never do. I don't know whether the 35% decline ever made sense, but certainly a rally from that decline was not crazy. When you saw the government seem to be taking actions, stock market gets crazy on a daily basis when they see things like somebody reported on a vaccine. We don't really know how substantive it is, but that always happens. So I don't necessarily regard the stock market as that wacky. Of course, if it declines 25% the next 3 weeks, you'll tell me I didn't know what I was talking about. But nobody, ever does. It doesn't strike me as that wild.
Well, there are still some companies that fundamentally are still healthy.
Sure, Amazon is looking pretty good right now. And,
yeah, absolutely.
Amazon and the other technology companies are looking, whoever makes Zoom is probably doing pretty well. But the technology companies are a very large part of the stock market.
Right.
But there are other companies which are very big, which aren't doing well. Disney is doing terribly. That's the biggest entertainment company. And so I imagine, can't open the parks, that sort of thing.
Right. So we have a couple of shaloms on this. The first shalom asked the question, you said that the Fed lends but does not spend. However, is it not true that the Fed is spending to buy assets, including securities? And I think that comes from the father shalom. We'll get to the son in a moment.
The Fed buys securities. When they say it doesn't spend, the Fed doesn't purchase goods and services. So Fed spending is on pieces of paper, not on physical items, not on PPE. I used to joke about the Fed getting around that in bizarre ways. The Fed, people probably don't know, the Fed has a big operations center in East Rutherford. And I was always joking, it's a pain in the neck to go from the Fed's Wall Street office to East Rutherford, right? It is, people do have to go there. I said, why doesn't the Fed build a tunnel and a rail line to connect better? The Fed can build buildings, but no, the Fed generally does not, that doesn't spend on that's the goods and services. That's the difference.
So before I get to Renee's question, because I think you might have to read it because it's long, while we're on the Fed, Carney wants to know if you think the president's hostility towards the Fed and his attempts to manipulate the Fed will impede the recovery.
I think, well, obviously, the rhetoric from roughly late 2018 to early this year between the president and the Fed was very disturbing. It's very odd. He was basically attacking an official he appointed. That was very, very strange. I don't think it affected policy that much, but it made for an uncomfortable position. I think he has held off from the Fed. He hasn't spoken about the Fed at all that I can hear of. Of course, the Fed reduced interest rates to zero, which he liked. Now he's talking about we should have negative interest rates. Negative interest rates is a shoreless sea. They do it in some countries. Basically, negative interest rates, you pay somebody to hold your money. If you have money at the bank charges you a storage fee.
Seriously?
Yeah, that's what it would be. That's what effect would be. That's a negative interest rate. And the same thing is you're lending money, you pay them a fee for holding your money. Obviously that's a very messy situation because obviously, I don't know if we have some tax lawyers here. There's a lot of odd tax angles to it. There's a lot of computer problems connected to it. It's something that I have to say, this is a case where academic economists propose something which looks on paper remarkably effective. Renee's professors, I'm sure, all say how wonderful an idea it would be. And Trump sort of bumbles into it, we should have it. It's not even clear it will be legal in the United States for some details of the Federal Reserve Act for the Fed to do that. So, but Trump hasn't talked about that. That's been off the table for months.
Charlie, Renee's question, it's in a multi-part question, so I'm just going to take out some parts of it. What he's saying, one of the questions is, how accurate is our picture of unemployment and whatnot when there has been, or what's happened is we have this large underground economy, undocumented workers who've been clearly harmed by the economy. So, how accurate are our official statistics when we have this large unaccounted for workforce?
Well, there is always a question about the accuracy of economic statistics, and a lot of economic statistics are still acquired by knocking on people's doors and picking on the phone and seeing if somebody's around and asking them. And certainly, there's been problems getting that the last few months, and the statistical agencies have noted that. They probably is a larger margin of error right now. And there certainly is always been an underground economy, off the books economy, and the people are doing things which aren't recorded in the official statistics. We don't know how much that contracted in this downturn. We don't know if it contracted at a faster rate or a slower rate. People might have gone into the underground economy when the regular economy grew. I mean, I would view that as a complication.
Yeah.
I think the broad movement of the numbers has been so strong that, the question of whether the second quarter GDP declined with 25% rate or a 35% rate or a 40% rate, I don't think is a terribly important issue. I mean, I have to say, and there was debates about maybe there was some problems with the questions and the unemployment rate was really higher than 14.7% in April. Maybe it was 17%. I think those are second order questions. Those are good questions for graduate students to worry about for their thesis. I don't think
We're going to let Renee worry about that.
Yeah, I don't think they're that important for policymakers. Not that Columbia would ever have a graduate student do a thesis on data. Never.
I think Renee's taking that on. So I'm going to go to Sarita's question, which is a little more philosophical, if you will. She said, if you could have advised Congress, would you have recommended providing money to keep people in their jobs, as was done? And I think European countries did that, providing unemployment when people lost their jobs. So do you provide money so you can keep people in their jobs, as I think some European countries?
Oh, yeah. I think in an ideal world, I would have done something like that. You would have basically provided money so businesses can pay their expenses, which includes their payroll. So the business can basically pop back up when it has to. Absolutely. I mean, there are questions about how you set up the rules and the criteria for that. I would absolutely agree. That's a more effective way. But in the American system, we use what we have. We have the unemployment insurance system. We poured more money into that. And that was a tough read to lead on. We had the Small Business Administration. We used that as a conduit. We used the tools we had. Would it be better to have reworked everything, to have been more European, would have been more effective? I think so. I'm not going to disagree with
that. So staying with Europe for a minute, lots of talk about Sweden and basically ignoring the epidemiologists.
Yeah.
What's your take on what's happening there?
Again, I read the articles today that, the U.S. and Brazil are not the only countries which have had responses which don't seem to have worked that well. And so Sweden is usually thought of to have a pretty efficient, reliable government. So it's not necessarily the character of the people in charge which determines these things. Again, that's an epidemiologist. I mean, a lot of the epidemiologists were saying, what are they thinking of at the time when Sweden proposed this? And I think there was an interesting article that said, it's true that Sweden sort of delayed the economic collapse by keeping things open compared to, say, Denmark or Norway. But Denmark and Norway seem to be having a lot easier job didn't have as bad a pandemic and have an easier job reopening than Sweden. That's all I can say. I don't think economists were involved. This was the Swedish government didn't seem to be going along with the normal epidemiology recommendations. That's all. Which is why there's no conflict between epidemiologists and economists. The good epidemiology seems to be good economics.
It's encouraging to hear you say that, that staying safe makes for good economics.
Yeah.
So I don't see any more questions. Anybody want to unmute themselves because they didn't want to write it up and put it out there?
I think there was a question about the national debt someplace.
I wrote out a question, but I don't mind stating it.
Okay, go on.
It's an economist's view of our local economy. I'm talking about Montclair.
Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Housing rents have increased all over, and in Montclair we are considering rent control. And as an economist who must recommend policy choices, can you comment on the economic advantages and disadvantages of rent control?
Oh, well, rent control is a very, very sensitive issue for people. And Montclair is a small place. I mean, I think the desire for rent control is, certain diversity in the community. So you want to keep certain people. But economists are always saying, but aren't there more efficient ways to do that than rent control? I would personally favor, if it could be done on a town level, but the town doesn't have the tools, I guess, something like housing vouchers. You give people, money where they can pay a market rent. But, again, that institutes who gets those money, who gets those funds. Again, as an economist, sort of pledge to say I don't like rent control, and in general I don't. But I don't. This is, I know, is a hot button issue, and I really don't want to get too far into it. I don't live in Montclair.
You live one time. That's what you just said. Right. What you just said, if you move from rent control to vouchers, the government picks up the difference.
Right. In other words, the cost falls put it this way, the cost falls on all the taxpayers in Montclair. If you have rent control, the cost falls on the landlord.
Correct.
And correct. So I think that would be the obvious difference. So, in principle, a housing voucher is more efficient. But again, you have the question of how do you identify the people eligible for the housing vouchers? What are the criteria? But it's the same thing in rent control systems, have the same complications.
Right.
It reminds me of what Jesse Helms used to say: "Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that man behind the tree." And the man behind the tree is the landlord, so
Yeah.
he wants to pay.
Yeah, effectively, it's a tax on landlords.
Okay. Spoken like a good commercial developer, David.
Well, there are landlords in this group.
So yes. So I have two questions. So let me take Susan's and then I'll go to Manny's. Susan said, how do you get more money to the states? Speaking of vouchers or anything else the state needs to do.
Well, in principle, and of course, people are talking about this, and hopefully the July stimulus package, the federal government just gives money to the states, big grants and aid. People are talking about the federal government maybe picking up a larger share of Medicaid, the state's Medicaid expense, which is a very big item in New Jersey. I think, I don't know how many billions a year New Jersey spends on Medicaid, which would be an obvious thing in a pandemic. So it would basically, we did this fair amount of it, probably not enough in 2009 under the Obama administration. But there should be some. The difficulty there is federal aid tends to have tight strings attached. It can only be spent on certain things. You have to justify to the feds, and there winds up with these back and forth on what you're buying, what you're spending on. About 50 years ago, and this is Nixon. I mean, again, people talk about, it's funny how liberal Nixon looks nowadays. The federal government switched to unrestricted block grants to states, just give the states money and they can spend what they want. But we've drifted away from that. And personally, I think it's because of DC, they want to control the money, whether it's Republican or Democratic administrations. They don't want the states to spend it on, quote, the wrong things. I personally favor unrestricted block grants. Not going to happen.
All right, well, we heard it here. So here's one for your crystal ball from the Schragers. If vaccines are 6 to 9 months away, what do you see as the consequences of that?
Well, I think the consequences before the vaccine is what we're waiting for it.
Right, and if we're talking about 6 to 9 months,
then I think what we're going to see is the numbers, like for GDP, look quite strong in the third quarter because we're coming off this incredibly low level. Then we're going to see much slower growth in the fourth quarter. Like I said, I don't think we'd go in reverse, but the unemployment rate's going to stay very high. We're going to have a lot of struggles. We're going to have bankruptcies. We're certainly going to see a lot of big retail chains just disappear off the face of the earth. I mean, they've already gone bankrupt. The question is when they start to liquidate. And that's what's going to happen. And a vaccine, let's face it, it's got to be distributed. People have to take it, and people have to be reasonably sure that it works. People are going to be suspicious of the vaccine. And vaccines always have side effects. The first 1 or 2 reports of a side effect, it's in the modern world. Again, if you read about the Salk vaccine, that was sort of the magic vaccine. when they were doing the initial trials, the Salk vaccine is a dead virus vaccine. But one of the companies, which was putting together the samples, mixed some live virus in, and some kids got polio. Now that was it. They traced it out. They fixed it. But you could imagine that happening today. Something like this, like 50, maybe 100,000 kids around the country got it. But can you imagine if something like that happened today? What the stories would be like in today's media world?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
So, we have time for other two questions. Anybody else have?
I'll talk, wherever that is.
Is that Jerry? Okay. Jerry doesn't write his questions. He wants to say.
No,
Go ahead.
I also, well, I started writing it, but I ran out of ink. Anyway, Charlie, you're very well aware that on the stock market, the S&P, six stocks, the S&P in the stock market, six stocks represented 22% of the move, and 10 stocks represented 30% of the move because of weighting.
Yeah.
And the broad market has done nothing like the indexes. In fact, a lot of companies have cut dividends, etc.
Yeah.
Of course, even cutting dividends, the market has its own will and goes up. Do you feel that at some point there'll be a pipe? We have to pay the piper.
Again, I'm not a great student or predictor or forecaster of the stock market. I have enough problems. I'm not that great at the economy as a hell. That's a lot easier than the stock market.
Sorry, I mean, let me just say this: how much money
Wait, Jerry,
put in to stop that from happening? Is that in the?
How much? What? How much? I couldn't quite hear
what he said. Jerry. What Jerry's saying is, how much money could the Fed put in to stop that from happening?
I know the Fed isn't, people think that the Fed is aiming to get the stock market to a certain level. The Fed's job is to try to keep the economy, do everything it can to help the economy. The legislation says maximum employment and stable prices. It doesn't say the stock market. The Fed recognizes the stock market collapses. That's bad news for the economy. The Fed recognizes you got to keep the financial system working. But the Fed isn't going to juggle its moves. Say you had a 10%, 15%, even 20% correction in the stock market. I don't think that's going to cause the Fed policy to change radically. So we got this impression because I think Greenspan really was either was calm times or he had great instinct for so many years that we had the Greenspan put on the market. And the market goes down, Greenspan will take the right action to get it up. That's a trap the Fed got into, I'm afraid. I don't think Greenspan was trying to do that necessarily. And everything else, things people say about the Fed. I remember it's about 20 years ago. I remember Howard Ellis coming up to me. This is the Clinton administration, so it's more than 20 years ago. But Howard Ellis comes up to me and he says, "Well, I think Greenspan and Bob Rubin are doing a great job running the economy." I wanted to go, "Oh." Greenspan and Bob Rubin and Rubin was Treasury Secretary. They don't run the economy. I think people just give the Fed too much merit for magic powers, and then damn it if it doesn't work. They're doing something for.
No, the truth of the matter is that people think that the stock market is the rich, but 50% of the market is all the people that are sitting on this call.
Well, the stock market,
all the IRAs, all the 401ks, all the corporate plans. I believe that's about 50% of the stock market.
I think what it is, about 50% of the population owns stock either directly or indirectly, either directly own stock or own a mutual fund or have an IRA, which is invested in a mutual fund or in a pension plan or in a pension, still an old-fashioned pension plan, which owns a lot of stock. I mean, that said, it's still for the first of all, it means 50% of the population, which is a lot, nothing. And also of that 50%, more than half them, the stock ownership is very small. The stock market is still pretty much owned by the affluent. It really is not, it's really not that widespread. It's probably gotten narrower than it did, say, 20 years ago. I mean, I think maybe 20, 30 years ago, it was more common for people to own stock than nowadays.
Yeah. Those of us who do are very fortunate, I guess.
Well, the thing
So
about owning
with-
stock in situations like March, don't look at the market. Don't look at
Say
it.
that again. Say that again, Charlie. I think that I just
When you
lost
have
your.
something like March and everything's falling apart, don't look at the market.
Right.
Don't sell. Everybody who says, what happened to my 401k? Well, it's back. Unless you were silly enough to sell in March, you're okay.
I think those are some wise words to sort of wrap this up on.
I'm not a registered investment advisor, though. I have to warn you.
That's why it's probably wise to hear that from you. Stay put. Everybody stay stable, and hopefully we will find a way out of this.
Yeah.
I want to say a really big round of thanks to you for preparing. And
Thank you. Thank you.
we get one or two claps.
Thank you, Charlie.
Before I let you all go, I think Elliot was here, but I think I've lost him. Elliot Fisher, who's a member of Shomrei, is a professor of mathematics. In his spare time, he's done research on the development of the atomic bomb. And I don't know if you've all seen the title of next week's At Nourish, but it's how the Nazis developed the bomb for the US. And what he has done is he has researched a number of the Jewish scientists, the Jewish German scientists, who ended up immigrating to the US and doing incredible work on the bomb. So that is next week at 8:00. And he wanted the title, How the Nazis Built the Bomb for Us. So that should be interesting. That should be fun. So come back next week. Let's do this again. And Charlie, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Much appreciated.
Yay!
Thank
you, Charlie.
Thank you, Shirley.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, guys.
Thanks, Shirley.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.